This is DibTech Talk, a show where we make sense of all things cybersecurity for the defense industrial base. Did you know that trust but verify is actually a Russian proverb that President Reagan used during the Cold War to talk about nuclear disarmament? The concept of trust but verify worked for preventing nuclear war, but it doesn't work to prevent cyber war. To help prevent cyber attacks, we need zero trust. So what is the concept of zero trust? Zero trust is a security model where nothing is automatically trusted, and anything, whether inside or outside of your perimeters, must be verified. Stay tuned as we unlock the concept of zero trust.
My name's Greg Scasny. I'm a cyber guy, best way you can put that. But I have a degree in electrical engineering from Purdue, boiler up. I spent most of my career doing cyber stuff. So out of school, I was hired to do ICS and OT security for a large steel manufacturer. Cigent is the name of the company, and what we're all about is protecting data at both from the inside out, which is kind of a zero trust nomenclature, right? So protecting the data from the inside. All data breaches happen really from the inside, even though they're external actors. But we're protecting data from the inside out as close to the data as possible. So what that means is we're looking at things of where you store the data, so that data that goes onto your SSD, and then we do things with network packets, right? So again, that very low level. Two things you can't get away from if you're a remote adversary is you can't get away from stealing data off an SSD, and you can't get away from sending packets. So that's where we're going to focus our efforts. We are creating a line of both software and hardware-based protections in SSDs, which is really neat. So we manipulate the firmware with partners in solid-state storage devices to provide cybersecurity protections at that level, right? So we can protect data on the SSD itself. We can do all kinds of neat things and lock data away, protect it, protect CUI. We can encrypt it. We can do all kinds of stuff. And it all happens kind of autonomously. We integrate with both any kind of second factor authentication, so YubiKeys and Google Authenticator, all that kind of stuff that goes along with zero trust, right? So to get access to some of that data on your hard drive, you have to continuously authenticate and tell us that, hey, you are who you are if you want access to that data, or else you're not getting access to it. So again, very much in that zero trust paradigm.
So manufacturers are, with the CMMC being, I won't say squeezed, but confused the most. And recently I've become confused on DoD's vision for the CMMC because NIST 80171 is for IT environments, explicitly
Right.
for IT environments. But yet the DoD is saying, lottie-dottie, everybody has to be CMMC. And so the manufacturers, there are 30,000 manufacturers in the defense industrial base, and they're kind of like, well, okay, this doesn't really fit, but if you're
That's
saying
the
you have to do
problem.
it. But then on a town hall on Tuesday night, DoD said something like, we realize that NIST 80171 is for IT and that there will be follow-on activities for OT. So now I'm wondering, is the CMMC not going to apply, or is NIST not 80171 not going to apply? So how are
Yeah.
manufacturers supposed to be?
So, and I'll weave this into the zero trust thing too, because I think it kind of it'll show some of the. I'm a big fan of zero trust from my background. So my background is mostly offensive related, right? So I was a penetration tester, red team operations, adversary emulation, that kind of stuff. So when zero trust came out, which was a term coined by Forrester about 10 years ago, it was the notion that you, instead of trust but verify, which is kind of the standard operating procedure for most networks, right? So if you go into your office, you plug into a network, you're inherently trusted on that network. You can have access to things. You may not be authenticated yet, but you're trusted to access certain things on that network, regardless of who you are, right? So by being inside of the network, you're given certain abilities to do things, query Active Directory, look at things like that until you're authenticated and do other things. Zero trust takes a little different approach to that, where it's never trust, always verify, right? So you never trust anything on the network. You actually don't even give anything network access until you've verified that the authenticity of the person and the device trying to access that, and then give them explicit permissions to only what they need, right? Which is great. So what it's, from a high level perspective, what it really is designed to do is to stop what they call lateral movement from an attacker from happening. And so so here's what happens, right? And this just happens. There's a really good article that I can send to anybody who's interested. It just came out. It was about the Lazarus group. So the Lazarus group attacking the defense industrial base. So very specific, using some malware called Threat Needle. But what they do is they get into a machine, and then they do reconnaissance from that machine, and then they move to other machines across the network until they can get into higher level machines. And they were able, in the write-up, they were actually able to get into another network that had no internet access. So kind of like an air gap, but not really. There was a router in between. They got access to the router and then created routes and able to get in there and exfiltrate data. That lateral movement becomes it happens all the time. So people need to realize that, when attackers get into any attack you've heard of in the past 5 years, so any ransomware attack, any of the big attacks you've heard, that stealing of credentials and lateral movement across the network is a very high priority for an adversary. They may be able to, compromise a user, but that user, again, if they're not a privileged user, doesn't do a whole lot for them. They need to get to other systems. By implementing zero trust, you don't give anything that lateral capability, right? So you don't have the ability to get in. You only get access to what you need to have access to. You're not inherently trusted. So it's very difficult for an attacker to move laterally. But that difficulty in moving for an attacker when you implement zero trust is also a hindrance to the adoption of zero trust. So let's look at that from an ICSOT perspective, right? So industrial control systems on a control system network, two things are important, right? Uptime and integrity of the data. The confidentiality of data doesn't really mean a whole crap load, right? A data, if it's a few milliseconds old, it's junk. It doesn't mean anything. So they're really not trying to protect the confidentiality of the data, it's speed, and integrity of that data. So to try to silo things off in an ICS environment, just not going to happen, right? You're going to have this network where trust is inherent based on where it's connected. And that goes against the tenet of zero trust. So it's very, very difficult for ICS and OT operators to implement a zero trust methodology inside a control system environment. It doesn't say you couldn't do it in the business environment, right? So, but it's not a panacea either, right? So one of the tenets behind zero trust is also, so again, there's no best way I can put this. You can't go out and say, give me zero trust product X, and now I have zero trust across my whole entire network. It doesn't work that way. There's no product you can go out and buy that does it. It's a process. And unfortunately, again, as much as I'm a big fan of it, it's not an easy process. So Akamai is probably one of the largest companies that implemented zero trust. They're a content delivery network. 9 years from start to finish to implement a zero trust across their entire network. That's a long time, and that's a buy-in to a methodology that you have to get buy-in from the top down. This isn't an IT job, right?
Right. So, okay. So let's break this down super Barney style. I'm a business owner. I understand the idea of zero trust. I really like it. So how do I do it? You just said there's no tools that, can implement zero trust. It has to be essentially built into your network, either over 9 years or from the beginning. So if I'm a brand new business, I'm hiring 7 new people, and I'm buying, 7 new laptops, and I'm configuring this for my network, right? How do I build in that zero trust? What does that actually look like in practice? How are my employees going to, what does the interface look like for my employees accessing my zero trust network? Does that mean they're going to have a pin and token for every single thing that they do? Does that mean that they're going to have a fingerprint and a password? What does that look like in practice?
Multi-factor authentication is a huge part of it. So what does it look like? It all depends on where your data sits and how you classify your data, right? Which I'm just going to be brutally honest, most people are absolutely atrocious at. Right. I don't care what size company you have. If in larger companies can do it easier than smaller companies, but do you say, hey, let's classify your data and know who needs to have access to what? That's a year-long project as it is. So, but you need to understand where your data sits, who has access to that data, and what level of access they need. Then you need to figure out, okay, what are the applications we have, right? So these applications, are they on premise? Are they in the cloud? What do we need to do? And then implement. Again, there's tons of different companies. I can mention companies by name, but there's a lot of different companies that will give you what they call these, and I hate to use technical jargon, but software-defined perimeters. It's basically a reverse proxy server that gives you some definitions around what you have access to inside your data center, whether that's on-premise or in the cloud or wherever you have your stuff. So that way, when you sit down at your computer, so I need to back up. There's so many pieces to it, it gets confusing. But so, okay, let's just go back. Understand where your data is and what you need to access. Understand what applications you have to give people access to. You also need to understand what devices you have, which this becomes problematic for zero trust, right? So with the advent of COVID, most people went remote work, right? So most people said, hey, I'm at home. You look like you're at home, right? So trying to figure out what devices are allowed to access not just the network, because you're not giving network access, but your applications and your data becomes problematic when people are using their own laptops. Zero trust really kind of goes on the tenet that you know what your devices are and you trust those devices themselves. So like the way Google did it with BeyondCorp is, you can't have a BYOD device on Google's network. All their devices are managed through a very complex, inventory management system. They get certificates that are secured, and that allows you that first level access until you authenticate with your multi-factor authentication. So, but those things around that zero trust things that you would see is, again, it's going to be some kind of data management, application management, device management, and then authentication management. So some kind of single sign-on that provides multi-factor authentication, whether that's a YubiKey or a fingerprint or whatever the case may be. That kind of stuff. So again, once you're getting on, it really doesn't matter that, hey, you're plugged in at home, or you're plugged in at Starbucks, or you're plugged in or whatever. You only get access to those things that you actually need access to. And you do that continuously by authenticating, again, with multi-factor authentication or whatever authentication mechanisms you need. It's a lot for people to, especially for, from my experience, medium-sized companies, smaller companies. It really should be something that you should. It's not something that you're going to do overnight. And it's not a panacea either. The premise behind it is very, very good because, again, it definitely secures that big vulnerability in things that you won't know. And the way I mean that by that is, if you're only allowed this little enclave of access to your applications and your data, and you don't allow really network access, things like zero days on networking equipment and servers and things like that become less of a threat, right? So it's that their kind of risk profile goes down because if they can't get network access to it, they really can't manipulate it. But the security on that device now becomes very, very important, right? So
can you define what a zero-day exploit is?
Oh, absolutely. So, and again, if I use terms, interrupt me. And I like to talk, so you'll have to interrupt me.
I'm the same way, so I get it.
It's no problem. So a zero-day exploit is a vulnerability in a piece of hardware or software that has no patch for it, right? And is probably not known by the manufacturer themselves. Now, it doesn't mean it's not known. They just haven't patched it yet. So there's a vulnerability that will allow some level of access. Could be a denial of service or all the way up to what they call remote code execution, which means that I can implant code on that piece of equipment and then execute that code to gain privileged access to whatever it is, some kind of foothold in the network or on that device. So those are hard to defend against, right? If you don't know a vulnerability is there, how do you defend against it? And 0 days are out there, right? So, the U.S. government pays to buy 0 day vulnerabilities. There's bad guys out there who pay a lot of money for 0 day vulnerabilities and things like that. So they're out there, and you're just not going to know about them. And there's no way to understand what vulnerable systems are going to be, or what. There was a 10-year-old, even longer than that, vulnerability in Linux operating systems. Right, it has to do with the escalation of privileges with a command called sudo. Been there for 10, 12 years probably. They just now patched it. When you move to that zero trust mentality, I'm not saying those things aren't important, but it's harder to utilize those vulnerabilities against you if you just don't have that access, right? But again, on the flip side, like I talked about with the ICS environments, when you think about traditional server environments, right? So I may have an application server. That application server will need to talk to a database server. Those things need to talk to each other. So how do you one of the tenets behind zero trust is this thing called microsegmentation. And I'll talk about that for a second too. One of the best practices when it comes to designing networks traditionally is the segmentation of network assets, right? So if you look at the ICS and OT space, segmentation is a huge piece of how you defend and protect things in a control system network versus things that could be risky in a business network and in a DMZ and all that kind of stuff. So in even traditional IT environments, people should have these segmentation segments of their network. Now, that's easy to say. In practice, people don't do it very well. I can be brutally honest. I've done hundreds and hundreds of penetration tests, and I can tell you that most people who say, yep, we have all these different segments and they're great, but they don't put any controls between the segments. So you might as well just leave them wide open to each other, right? Zero Trust takes that idea of segmentation, which I really like. I'm going to move back so I don't keep hitting my camera. This idea of segmentation to the micro level. So you're doing this micro segmentation to the actual device level. So you're kind of segmenting each device by itself to give it just the access it needs. And that's great. So I think that's, from an end user device, that's good. But how do you do that in a server environment, like I talked about? So things that need to communicate to each other, if businesses have a hard enough time just doing generic segmentation, to do this micro segmentation on a server side, you're talking the barrier to entry is big, right? And that's the problem with some of this. Again, Zero Trust is great, but it's why it can't happen overnight. This makes it very, very difficult to just kind of plug and replace it. I think part of the issue with implementation too comes down to people are going to make mistakes, right? What I mean by that is implementation. Even if you hire a company to come in and they're Zero Trust, 100%, that will do you soup to nuts, bottom to top. Upon the implementation of that, something's going to break, right? You're going to lose access, right? But what's worse, right? So if it's a big enough loss of access and a big enough loss of business, the risk of you having a cyber attack and having that same thing happen versus it actually happening when you do it, you have to kind of weigh that risk as a business owner, right? To say, well, this is going to happen. So how much lost productivity am I going to get? Outage is still an outage regardless of who causes it. So,
Sure.
Things to think about.
Yes, there's human error in implementing, causing inadvertent outages or, lack of access or, things going crazy. But how does Zero Trust protect against the human element, whether from insider threats? Because that's a potential threat, even with Zero Trust, right? If that person is a threat, but also the social engineering aspect, right? Like phishing campaigns and that kind of stuff. How does Zero Trust work with those? Is Zero Trust bad with insider threats, right? Because in theory, if they're able to authenticate themselves, they're still an insider threat. Is there protection against insider threats, and then also the social engineering aspect? Does it help prevent those things?
It does help with insider threats to a point, right? So we have this saying, and it's on some of our documentation. I won't get it right, but basically, that a very skilled attacker looks like a privileged insider, right? So the issue that comes down to with any kind of security implementation is that there's going to be someone who has the keys to the kingdom, right? Someone or someone's a group of people. And those people will always be targeted. It's really hard. It's much easier from a Zero Trust perspective, though, because the first thing I talked about is classifying your data and only giving you access to the data that you need.
Least privilege. It's a concept required by the CMMC and NIST 171.
Exactly.
Giving access to what they need.
And using kind of like what they do for classified information, they need to know, right? It's only giving you access to data that you need to know, which is good. That will help compartmentalize what people have access to. So therefore, from an unprivileged insider, limit the scope of damage that they can do. Now, again, some group or person or persons has the keys to the kingdom because they have to set the stuff up. They have to do maintenance. They have to do that kind of stuff. So you really have to make sure that, you're following best practices when it comes to how you're securing your privileged accounts, that your IT guys don't get lazy. And they are. I get it. I mean, hackers are lazy too. When we did red team stuff, the easiest way I can get in is going to be the best way. So you have to take those privileged accounts very, very seriously in how you secure those things, because and how you audit and log those things, right? And how you spread those responsibilities out, right? So this is not so much a technology thing as it is a process. If you have one person who has the privileged access, then if he can get around and not get caught and that kind of stuff, then he has the potential for insider threat. But if you spread that responsibility out across multiple people, where you can, kind of do this, two key method of making changes and good change control and that kind of stuff, that's that helps to minimize that. From a social engineering standpoint, it's a little bit different model for threats, right? But again, realize that 90% of data breaches happen because of some kind of social engineering, phishing mostly, right? Zero trust works very well because, again, it does, but there are always a caveat, right? And I'll give you an example of a caveat too. If I'm a user, so let's just take the thing I talked about earlier, this Lazarus campaign that was targeting the defense industrial base, right? So it's kind of good for the audience. It was done with phishing. So they send them a Word document, which always happens, or some document that has some macro that's going to download something bad that's going to then allow them to take control. If you have the zero trust, once they're on that machine, they're kind of locked. They really can't do much. Now they may be able to get access to what that person has access to, right? So if that machine has access to your financial data and CUI data, whatever, that data is at risk. So you can't abandon your traditional security tools just because you have zero trust. So people will say, I no longer need network monitoring, or I no longer really need a firewall. Well, yeah, you do, and you should. You shouldn't abandon traditional, tried and true information security methods and defenses that you have just to replace it with zero trust. It should be part of that layered defense that you have. But there's still people that can cause issues. So one of the things that happens with zero trust is, and this is I don't want to get real technical, but basically the way the implementation is supposed to work is, again, you can't see, if you're on a network, you really can't, nothing is available. You can't see any services. You can't go to a website and log in until you actually make a request. And then that service you're trying to access will reach out to you and then allow you to access it that way. But did you hear about the water plant in Tampa?
Yes.
Right. So let's put this in a zero trust type of environment. They couldn't, right? So this is a HMI, so a human machine interface computer that controls control systems, right? So usually sit on the control system network, or maybe sit on the business network and then have access in the control network. Bad practice, by the way. Someone had, so let's say that this machine, let's say it was a zero. Let's say it was in a zero trust environment. Great, it's there, it's doing what it's supposed to, only has access to what it's supposed to, but someone installs TeamViewer on it, right? So if you're not monitoring for that kind of stuff, and they weren't, this is part of why you still couldn't abandon your traditional defenses. They stopped using TeamViewer 6 months ago. They say, hey, it's not allowed on our network anymore, but this machine had it on there, and again, no one knows how the guy got what he got. There's going to be some kind of insider there, got to be, but they logged in via TeamViewer and made changes to the sodium hydroxide levels, try to hurt a bunch of people, right? So that machine had access to do that. So in a zero trust environment, again, if you're going to try to abandon your traditional defenses, you're going to miss, right? So it has to work together with traditional defenses.
Yeah. So speaking about OT environments and IT, can we talk about zero trust in an OT environment? Because you talked about how difficult it is to implement zero trust with servers, and that sounds like an easier problem to solve than an OT environment, and separating business systems from OT systems, and in this concept of zero trust. How should manufacturers in the defense industrial base be thinking about this?
So to do true and zero trust is not really possible on the control system network, right? So like I talked about before, that control systems have to talk to each other. They just have to, and so they're just going to be inherently trusted. So you have to. You can take those same elements, and and the government has tons of great documentation about how you should actually segment off your control system networks and not allow internet access and all that kind of stuff, and how you should monitor your business networks for ICS control traffic and make sure that's not you're not I don't want to say contaminating, but you're not allowing that access back and forth. Where you can implement zero trust is on that business network side. Right, so you're not going to do it on the control system side. So you have to put in other compensating controls for that. On the business network side, though, you could start to use this idea of zero trust, right? Where Just because I'm plugged into the business network does not mean I get access to anything. I have to have other things that, again, whether that's, agents that go on your computer. There's a lot of different companies that do that, but it still comes down to who the users are, what their devices are, what do they need access to, what should they have access to. And as those things change, being able to quickly adapt to that part of that's the one thing that I think companies that are not security companies or not real IT based organizations will always struggle with is that kind of ongoing, I don't want to call it maintenance, but the ongoing handling and running of a network, right? So most people want to say, most companies, if you're, most small and medium sized companies don't even have an IT staff, right? They hire it out to an MSP. And how do MSPs make money? MSPs make money by the less you call, because you pay a monthly fee for your IT services, the more money they make. So they want to make sure things run and they don't have to mess with it too much. Zero Trust is not that way, because people's roles are changing. You're having attrition. You may be hiring people. And so as people's roles change, if you don't have those things well defined about which role and what data they need to have access to, you're going to be playing a lot of this now I'm getting calls because, Jimmy can't access the Excel file he needs, or whatever the case may be. So without having those defined roles of what data you need to have access to, how you can access times, all that kind of stuff. And you have to continuously massage those. You're continually, doing that maintenance on that. It's not a just plug it and be done solution, right? And security is not that way anyway. So
no, for sure. And so kind of back to this concept of roles, and you're talking about it in a different way than I'm about to go, but with regards to implementing zero trust or implementing an architecture in general for your IT systems, who is ultimately responsible, right? I'm working on my MBA at Cornell, and so we talk a lot about the C-suite and we talk a lot about responsibilities, and we haven't really talked much about the technology side of businesses. Every company has a business system. They have an IT infrastructure of some sort. Everybody has a computer with an email. So if I'm an IT guy, or maybe I'm the CISO / ops manager / running all things day to day, and I want to implement something like this, should I be going to my CEO and my C-suite and saying, look, we really need to do this? It seems like it's a business decision, right? More so than just an IT decision.
Most security decisions are business decisions, right? And it shouldn't be left to, I'm a CTO. Most of the things that you're going to implement when it comes to security have to be done at that C level, right? And again, if you're going to move to a zero trust, which is a huge change, it's not just a technology change, it's a cultural change in the organization, right? So it's just different the way you're going to do things. You have to figure out how you're going to, this is a change that it's not like rolling out a new office suite, right? This is a fundamental change in how people do business. And I can tell you that one thing that will get you a lot of complaints is if you fundamentally change how someone does a job. If you don't believe me, right, just go ask anybody who's ever replaced a phone system, right? Something as simple as a phone, right? So, back in the day, people had traditional telephone lines and moved to a voice over IP system, right? You change that phone. Oh, now I got to hit 7 instead of 6. People lose their ever-loving minds.
Yes.
Right?
Well, and the DoD is forcing some of this change with the CMMC, right? They've required NIST 800-171. I'm not sure how familiar you are personally with the CMMC.
Very.
Yeah. So everyone's kind of waved their hands like, oh yes, we're compliant. But now DoD is saying, okay, we're going to have a third party come and check. So my daily job involves checking on companies and asking, how are you doing this? Are you doing this? And some of them, their business practices do not allow them currently to implement NIST 800-171. They have these inherent setups that would involve changing not necessarily the whole business model, but a lot of people are going to be very angry about changing their culture. And it is just as simple as not having shared accounts. And that's a really simple thing.
Right. And impossible to do in an ICS environment, right? ICS environments inherently have shared accounts, and you can't get around it. Just how the vendors do it. Now, that'll change.
This isn't an IT environment.
But in IT environments, the CMMC is going to be very interesting. With NIST 800-171, it's you check the boxes, you self-attest, right? No one's coming to check, right? Yeah, we do all this stuff. Oh, we kind of do that. And they give it to the IT guy. The IT guy, oh yeah, we're doing all that. I'll get to that. Yeah. Um, Now with CMMC now, so we're going through, our company's doing SOC 2 Type 2
Hmm.
certification, right? So you have to provide evidence and all that. Very similar what you have to do for CMMC, I believe.
Hmm.
That's a wake up call for people, and it should be. And again, it should be not just the IT guys or CTOs or CIOs' responsibility. This is really, CEO level, that they have to embrace this. And again, now it's being forced upon them that they have to do that. I have different emotions on it. I think in the end, I really think it's a good thing. I don't see anything in CMMC that is a bad practice, right? That you shouldn't do this. But are they going to allow, again, I just don't know. Are they, if a business, like on the HIPAA, so let's say you're a medical facility, right? And you say, HIPAA, much like CMMC, says you must do these things. We're not going to tell you exactly what technology you have to use. You have to do these things, and how you decide to implement it is your thing. And if you can't implement it, then you need to give us a compensating control of what else you're doing to help you get to this. And I don't know if CMMC would be the same way.
It doesn't. It's very
I
restrictive
didn't think so.
for compensating controls. There has been discussions lately about using not applicable, because there are three findings in the CMMC assessment guide. As of right now, it's either you've met the control, you've not met the control, or they're not applicable. So right now, these OT environments, a lot of them are not applicable, and there's
Sure.
no requirement to have a compensating control. So you're telling them, don't worry, it doesn't apply to you. And don't worry, you don't have to do anything about it. So that's the scary part, um, right there. But in your opinion, do you think that zero trust should have been included in the CMMC? And I ask that because yes, NIST exists. No, you're probably not going to modify NIST without years of public comment and work. But the CMMC added 20 controls on top of NIST 800-171, and they added 3 documentation requirements. You have to have policies, you have to have documented policies, documented procedures, and a documented resource plan. But there is no mention of zero trust in any of this. Do you think they've missed the ball on talking about it or recommending it or in some way implementing it into culture, like they're trying to implement cybersecurity into culture?
I think that would probably it. Do I think it's a good idea to implement zero trust? Yes. Do I think it's a good idea to mandate zero trust? Probably not. And here's why: is that if you were to take any company of size, or even not of size, so I mean, our company is a little bit different. We are a zero trust type company. Now, are we 100%? No, but I don't have Active Directory. We're not a Microsoft Active Directory shop, right? So, but most people utilize Microsoft Active Directory. And so if you don't know what Microsoft Active Directory is, it's, where you have that when you log into your computer with Windows and it says, give me your username and password, that authentication mechanism and the permissions you get come from this Active Directory environment. That's a difficult environment to implement zero trust. Active Directory may not be your best choice for true, single sign-on or dual factor authentication, that single root of trust for who your users are. It may not be the best choice. So now if you say, well, if you're going to be in a defense industrial base, you must implement zero trust, you're going to put a lot of people out of business because it's not cheap.
For sure.
Right. And I'm not saying even CMMC is cheap, but I think that with the controls that are in CMMC, none of them are unreasonable. And most of them are best practice. So most of these divs are going to have to adjust some level of what they're doing. But I don't think it's enough to put them out of business. And if it is, then they probably shouldn't be in business in the first place because they're going to get hacked, right? They're just not doing things in a good way.
Yeah, so NIST 853, which is for federal information systems, it gives the government the option to use AES or FIPS validated, whereas 171 mandates FIPS validated cryptography standards for protecting the confidentiality of CUI. Is that, how do you feel about that mandating that encryption standard?
So I don't have too much of it. So if people would just use encryption, period, would be a good start, right? But encryption is hard to manage, and that's part of what our company does is try to help with that level of that. The purpose of mandating a FIPS based encryption is that what that algorithm is. You can, if we had 10 minutes, I can create an encryption algorithm just in Python right now, right? Doesn't mean it's good. Doesn't mean that, it protects things. The AES standard has been out there for a very, very long time. So it's very, very good. And then, so with FIPS, they're just mandating that you utilize these specific encryption algorithms for the protection of the information that they're giving you. So I don't think that that's, excuse me, that is bad or even hard or expensive. Matter of fact, it's not expensive. It's unless you are creating technology that you need to get FIPS certified, right? So like we create hard drives that need to be FIPS certified. That's an expensive proposition, but that's our business. Our business is storing data. So, but you as a user, to store CUI using either AES or even if it's just, hey, you can only use FIPS algorithms. There are AES FIPS validated encryption algorithms. You just use them and you store it that way. It's not a overarching or over where I'm looking for Scasny, but it's not an over burdensome requirement. Is the word I was looking for.
That is awesome. So I take an informal poll on some of these interviews. What's the number one threat that you've seen either recently or historically, like career long? What would you say boils down to the number one threat?
So the
Or
number
vulnerable.
one,
Vulnerable.
well, it's
Like,
very difficult, right? So, when you look at, one of the things I like is data, right? So there's this principle called the dream principle. You ever hear this? So
no.
it's called data rules everything around me. It's a dream. Data rules everything around me. And there's people out there who collect data, lots of it, like Verizon, right? So Verizon goes out and does data breach investigation reports. They have this huge corpus of data that then they hire data scientists to go and kind of boil that stuff down, which is very interesting. And you can learn things from that distillation and aggregation of data. And some of the things they come up with kind of 4 reasons that cause data breach, right? And one of them is that most data breaches are caused by someone external. I know we talk a lot about insider threats, and that's not, again, you shouldn't ignore those. They do happen. But most insider things that happen are usually what we call an accidental insider. It's a mistake, right? Someone makes a mistake and they don't realize they made a mistake. And then an external attacker will take advantage of that mistake. And we see this, we have a security operations center. We have network-based tools that we install. We monitor networks for threats. We do continuous threat hunting out of our SOC, but we also profile things for mistakes. We can detect mistakes, and I won't get into the details of it, but I'm happy to explain it to anybody who's interested. But we see it all the time. We have a just great example of this. We have a TV station. It's actually a conglomerate of several TV stations, and we saw some oddities with our detection software. What happened? One of their IT guys was trying to get this video server to work, couldn't do it. He went in the firewall and created an any rule, right? And then forgot about it. Just like, because that kind of stuff happens. That was, again, if there had been a single piece of vulnerable software on that system, that's a data breach waiting to happen, right? So, but the number one cause of data breach external is still phishing. It's people. People are gullible, right? And it's going to happen. It happens more and more, especially with COVID, people working from home. The amount of fraudulent COVID emails, phishing emails that we see now is astronomical. And one of the things that and I wish I could have coined this phrase. It's not mine. I don't remember who said it. Mm-hmm. But the bad guys are smart too. Right. And that's something we have to really, these aren't dumb people that are sitting out there trying to break into these companies. These guys are smart. So they're going to take advantage. They know people are working from home. They know that companies didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare for this working from home. They know that, people are on the same network with their kids streaming and all this other stuff. And their home networks are not as defendable as a corporate network. Even if you're doing, again, most people hadn't had a chance to go in and do zero trust right away, right? So zero trust has been around for a while, but I guarantee you 99% of the people who work from home are not in that zero trust model. They're still using a VPN, which VPN can be done well, but again, it had to happen really, really fast. And what happens when things happen fast? You make mistakes, right? So those are the kind of threats that, once an attacker's in, there's all kinds of different methodologies they'll use to try to get around things. So it's hard to say like this one thing is what the cause of it. It always starts with some kind of phishing, always. But you just because it's phishing today and ransomware today doesn't mean it's going to be something different tomorrow when we solve that problem. So you still have to kind of keep that eye to the side, keep watching what's going to come down the pike. So
do you think the humans will always be the weakest link in
100%.
cybersecurity? Yeah.
100%. Everything's human, right? If there's a vulnerability, it's a human that did it, right? So everything's human. And people just trust, right? So, zero trust is supposed to get rid of that, but people are just trusting individuals. And if you don't know, you don't know, right? So no one's going to really scam me. Well, yes, they are. They're going to, right? So if training can help with some of that, but I got to tell you, I mean, even when you start to look at, I'm not talking the generic adversaries, because, you don't hear much about like people who don't have a whole lot of skills anymore, like the hacktivism, the anonymous stuff, right? So those guys didn't have any skills. They were just political activists.
Don't hear them. Don't tempt them.
They don't scare me. There are people out there that scare me. They're not one of them. But there are guys out there, that take their job very seriously. And the amount of information that is available on the internet about any one person or any one company or people associated with that company is just scary. People don't understand how much what we call open source intelligence there is. And now these guys are taking AI algorithms to go out and search for that open source intelligence information and gather that into phishing emails or any other kind of social engineering tactic they're going to use. And it's very convincing. It's very hard to say like, oh, this, they have so much information on me. How could this not be legit? They're up in their game, and they're going to continue up in the game. We have to keep right with them, the whole time.
So what is the best way to help bring up the human element, right? Like, is it through education? Is it through technical controls that we can get better at spotting these social engineering attempts? What is a company to do?
So it's a few things. One is definitely education, right? So, and it's got to be. I have a lot of opinions on how you educate people in cyber, but it has to be, it has to be engaging. It has to be. It can't just be the CBT like click the button, where they're doing this
challenge.
Exactly. It has to be things like that. It has to be things that are apt to what they're doing. Secondly, you have to have, again, it's still that kind of never trust, always verify. You should be monitoring your stuff. And if you can't monitor it, there are companies like ours who can monitor that stuff for you, right? So having the biggest issue that the bad guys know is that no one's watching. And I give presentations on this a lot. The bad guys know that no one's watching. They know that people don't understand that there's companies like ours that can, for a very reasonable amount of money, monitor your networks and watch them 24/7. If you're not doing that, the bad guys go in. If you look at that data I talked about with Verizon, the average time that an adversary spends inside of a network is 7 months or greater. So I can tell you, as a red team guy, we would have a month-long engagement, maybe sometimes 2 weeks, and we would steal everything we can. You give me 7 months, if I'm a real bad guy, you'll never ever get me out of that network.
Have you seen the SolarWinds timeline? It's published by SolarWinds.
Yes, I have.
Yes, because I come from a cyber operations background, so I was trying to explain to somebody about their cyber operations don't just happen, right? Like to your point, they happen 7 months over an average of 7 months. And so I started looking for that information. I found this timeline and I was like, yes, they were doing recon for a long, long time before they ever implanted anything and did anything. So when you're monitoring your network, it seems like you'd be able to spot the adversary potentially while they're doing their recon activities long before they ever
got to their action on objectives. Yeah. And SolarWinds is one of those things that is, you talk about difficult to detect. So when you have companies like FireEye, FireEye is a good company. I try to not mention companies, but even though we do compete with some things, but they're a good company. I mean, they know what they're doing. They put out a lot of research that's helpful to the community. When they're in a company like that and they're able to steal the red team tools, this was good. And that kind of stuff's going to happen. Now, again, when you look at the history of data breach, that supply chain thing, the supply chain attacks aren't as prevalent. It's just because they're harder to catch, right? So how do you catch? So all the technology you talked about, even the zero trust stuff with something like SolarWinds, people really need to realize that no matter what services they're using, right? Oh, my stuff's in the cloud. On the back of that cloud, there's a computer somewhere that you're using the CPU of and the hard drives of. It's there somewhere, and someone has to manage that. And that's where, the guys who did the SolarWinds hack were just brilliant in a devious sort of way. Attacking their Orion software, they knew they'd get access to the backbone of all these large, and it's used by everybody. And it's a whitelisted application. So you take all these protections that you're trying to do, whether it's your EDR programs, your antivirus, or your application whitelisting, all these things that you put in place, they're out the window. All those defenses are gone, right? So
Zero trust, no whitelisting, right?
But zero trust would have worked better in that maybe, because you're almost behind that, right? So with the SolarWinds stuff, you're behind even that veil of zero trust. You're not really talking about devices. You're talking about the metal that enables you to do things, right? So it makes it, and the networking equipment that allows all this stuff to happen. Those kind of things are scary. Now, again, if you do take that zero trust route, what people need to do and what they need to study, or at least understand, you've heard of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And that's a very technical framework. But you can take that and put that into like a kill chain, right? So in Lido Cyber or Lockheed Martin coined that term cyber kill chain, right? These are the things that kind of happen during a cyber attack. And if you can break that chain anywhere along the ways, you can stop that data breach. Well, I think the takeaway from that, from an executive standpoint or a business owner standpoint, is if you can understand that from a high level, and that's a thing that most people can understand, you can talk with your technical teams to figure out where along that attack chain you can put your defenses, because it's not just one place. You need to kind of put it all along from the reconnaissance phase all the way down to things if they're already doing their actions on objectives, which is the last thing, you're kind of screwed. But if you can plant things, place your defenses all along that attack chain to where you can detect, respond and all that kind of stuff, you're gonna be better off than most, right? So I'm a diver. Like I tell people I dive with, I don't have to swim faster than a shark. I just have to swim faster than you.
Sure.
Right. Cyber's kind of the same way, right? So if you can make yourself a hard enough target, then they're going to go away.
So I have a softball question, but I want to give some ammo for all the cyber guys out there who are fighting against their C-suite or fighting against their CEO. Why should a company care about cybersecurity? And I know that sounds like a dumb question to ask in 2021, but it seems like a constant fight between CISOs and CEOs for budgets, for allocation, for moving the football down the field here. Why should the C-suite care?
Because when it comes down to it, it's really kind of the viability and continuous operation of the business, right? So now it comes to the point where if you're not doing some kind of cyber defense, right now it's ransomware, right? So great. They're going to ransom all your stuff. And people, it's really hard for, I think, not hard, for the C-suite, the CEO, non-technical business manager to understand exactly how devastating you not being able to get access to your IT systems are. People remember the time when we ran businesses without IT. That doesn't happen anymore, right? Every business out there just about is an IT operation in some way. When you take those systems away, now you don't operate anymore, right? You're not making profit. You're not doing anything. And if you're lucky, you may get it back, but more than likely, you're probably not. These guys that do this, the ransomware attacks that we've helped investigate, again, these guys were in for a long time. They're smart. They know where you're doing your backups. They'll encrypt your backups too. And just because, I encrypt my data when I store it, well, I can re-encrypt your encrypted data and not give you access to it, right? So these guys understand what they're doing. They understand, all the different systems you use to manage and all that kind of stuff. And they want you to pay. And if you don't pay, you're going to be put out of business. And that's really it's really that serious. There are companies, even here, I live in South Florida, there's companies here that have been breached, and then 5 months later they file Chapter 11, right? They may have recovered from the breach, but the negative market connotations that you get as a company, who wants to do a business with someone who doesn't take security seriously? Now, even maybe you don't deal with that kind of information. Maybe it's just trade secrets, right? So now there was this Lazarus group that was attacking the defense industrial base. They weren't encrypting data. They're pulling data out and posting it online. So pulling out trade secrets and posting it for everybody to see. So let's take all your trade secrets, maybe stuff you don't have patented or whatever, that is just how you do business and all your goodies, and post it online for all your competitors to see. The implications are even higher for the DIBs, for the defense industrial base, right? Because it's just what you said. I mean, you're defending, I mean, even though CUI is really not classified data, but you're still defending things that, again, if you're not gonna take that piece of it seriously, of really defending just the CUI piece of it, how can you ever be trusted with a piece of classified data, right? So it's imperative that these guys understand that, and that's the whole reason Cigent got started. Was, my partner John is ex-NSA, he was ex-Air Force, he worked in the intelligence agencies for years. He truly understands, what the devastating effects of losing national security secrets are to our adversaries, and what people die, and Americans die from that. So anything we can do, again, to help stop that from happening, is what we want to do.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. So, yeah, thank you so much for your time, your knowledge,
Welcome.
your wisdom on all of this. So, I know that the people watching this are definitely going to gain something, and hopefully have a little token to take back to their C-suite and say, okay, if you're not going to listen to me, listen to this guy.
And I'm happy to talk anytime.